Hello, I'm Matt Kaplowitz. Thanks for joining me. We're going to spend a few minutes going through 10 tips for reading aloud STEM books to preschoolers. Now, the big point about reading aloud any book is that reading the words on the page is only the beginning. The process starts way before then. Number one, choose the right book. Pick a book with character, setting, and themes that you think your child or your student will like. Then read the book yourself and make sure you spot material you might want to skip or use or change at a different time. Once you're ready to start the book, initiate a discussion and just compare that book with other books you and your child or your student might have already read. Number two, once again, before reading the book, ask yourself the question, what kind of learner is your child? Is your child a sensory learner? Is your child a visual learner, a tactile learner? Get materials together that your child enjoys and are comforting to her or to him. For example, sand, rice, fabric pieces, finger paints. And since there are all of these other objects, it's important that your child is always supervised. Also, collect tactiles from around your house that your child has experience with and that you can use during the story. One thing is to get a box, put all the tactiles into a box, and then talk with your child or student about those objects. Are they the same as in the story? How are they different? Once you're ready to actually read the story, keep in mind to keep your child an active participant in the story and in the storytelling. Ask simple WH questions. What do you think is going to happen? Where do you think the object might fly? When do you think the next thing might happen in the story? Why do you think that happened? Once you're into reading the story, take your time. It's important to convey the richness of each page and to make sure your child understands the words. You never have to read a whole book in a day. You can look through the book and decide natural places to break the book up so you can read it over 2 days or 3 days. Main thing is to take your time, enjoy the book, ask the questions. Once you're on each page, before you're reading the words on the page, pick 3 or 4 objects. They might be objects relating to the STEM elements of it. It might be relating to some of the social emotional elements, including facial expressions, body language. Pick the objects to describe and go through them one at a time before you read the words. Typically, it's best to start from the specific and go into the general so that you point to the individual parts of an object, point them out, and then explain how they all fit together. Number 6, as you're reading the book, use vocal expressions to model the emotions, the social cues, and distance. Use the cues so that we know what the reaction is to objects that you're looking at, to what the reactions are to other people looking at it. The vocal expression can make a big difference. He lifts the object right up. She's really trying to pick up the object and she's trying very hard to lift it. Use your voice to help paint the story. As you're going through each of these pages, let your child or your student help tell the story. Predict what's going to happen. not only the WH words, but what are some of the elements that are happening within it in terms of, if it wasn't built like this, what if it was upside down? What if it was night? What if it was day? What if there were animals around? What if there were people that came in and asked questions about it? How would that change the story? Another fun thing to do is rhyming predictions. Think of rhymes and build them into the predictions. Here's an example. Anna built the blocks so high, they almost reached up to the sky. As you're looking at, and number 8, ask simple questions that explore feelings and foster empathy. Sometimes, even if it's a STEM book, especially if it's a STEM book, always keep the social emotional element as an important part of it. How do you think the people felt when they were trying to lift that element? How do you think the people would react if the wind blew so hard that they couldn't stand up against it? How do you think they would feel if the sound was so strong it almost stopped them from being able to think about anything else? What would you have done if you were the character and instead of building the tower, it collapsed? Number 9, the reading doesn't end when the story's over. When you finish the story, instead of just closing the book and saying, "Wasn't that a good story?" discuss it with your child. Explore the larger feelings and the larger issues using age-appropriate prompts. What was the story about? How was the problem solved? Continue to incorporate key STEM vocabulary words your child has learned into every conversation after that. Follow the reading of the story with a hands-on experience. If it's a story about the wind, be looking for places that there's wind or the movement of air and incorporate that into your discussions and your conversation. Last, number 10, make reading a family tradition. Reading isn't only something to do on a special occasion, and the reading that I'm talking about isn't before bed reading when your child is winding down. This is a special time of day set aside for that reading. Choose the time and engage their minds, not before bed, not before they're going to sleep. The other element of that is use a similar place all the time. Always do the reading in the reading chair or the reading corner. Keep it consistent, keep it fun, and always make it a part of the routine. So those are the 10 tips. Number 1, choose the right book. Number 2, what kind of learner is your child? Prep the reading by thinking about the sensory supports that your child can use and tactile supports for all children. Number 3, make your child a full participant in your reading experience. Load it up with WH questions. Number 4, take your time when reading the book. Number 5, on each page, before you read the words, describe 3 or 4 of the most important central objects. including facial expressions and body language. Number 6, use vocal expressions to model emotions, social cues, and distance. Number 7, let your child help tell the story. Let them do predictions, including rhyming predictions. Number 8, ask simple questions that explore feelings and foster empathy. Number 9, after reading this story, talk about it. And number 10, make reading a family tradition. Now we're going to go into Q&A, and I will be joined for a storybook conversation with Sarah Pedante, Chi-Ying Lim, and Christine Harradine, all from University of North Carolina's STEMI Center. Thanks for listening, and we'll now begin our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the amazing set of tips for families, as well as I can see, it would be a good reminder for practitioners as well. So maybe I'll just go ahead to start with the first question from Aubrey. Do you have any suggested criteria or considerations when choosing good STEM books for early childhood?
Definitely, sure. Definitely the first thing is to, again, match the book to your child or to your student. Think about what their sensory challenges are, what their learning challenges are, and also, in many cases, what their how long they can stick with a book. Sometimes there'll be really great books and there's just too many words on every page and they can't keep up with them. And sometimes if you're talking about kids on the spectrum, there's just too much sensory information on the page. Kids go into sensory overload and they can never actually dig into the book because there's just so many things they can't focus. So every parent knows their kid, and think about it from what is going to be sensorially friendly to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think, Sarah, would you like to kind of, extend that with kind of as a perspective as a parent?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So Ching knows that I have a young child, a preschooler with a developmental language disability. And part of how we've thought about storybook time with her and some of her attentional behaviors and keeping her engaged is using context personalization. So adding her photograph to some of the pages and having her reenact some of the activities that might be occurring to discuss that has been a really great activity to kind of pique her interest. And then choosing books that really relate to things that I know that she's interested in. So orange is her favorite color. She likes to ride bikes, that kind of thing. And so I found Matt's suggestions on that front to be really helpful and hope that that can be useful to Aubrey as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Sure. Would you like me to go ahead and take the next question from Cameron?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Cameron's asking if you have a list of resources to find STEM books for young children, and do you, Matt, have a tip page that you could share with families so that they could practice the tips that you just shared?
Well, STEMI, of course, has a remarkable collection of books broken down into science, technology, engineering, math, and Ching, probably you can post that link right to where that is. It's a fantastic list, and it's also broken down by age, and many of them have individualized tips for how to follow through the books when you're reading them. It's quite good.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think Christine just dropped the link to our Storybook Conversation series. And Christine and Sarah have, and Shuwen have all worked really hard on it. And we are going to continue to add on more of the adaptation tips to more storybooks. So, if you have any STEM books that your kids might be interested in, do send them to us, and we'll take a look at that and help you with it. So within that Storybook Conversations series, what we've done was to really focus on teaching practitioners and families how to use dialogic reading, which is really one of the interactive storybook reading that has one of the strongest evidence according to, What Works Clearinghouse. And so what this means with dialogic reading, it is a specific type of interactive reading, and that relies really on a set of strategies called PEER, which is prompt, evaluate, expand, and repeat. And, you can go to our website to learn a bit more about that. And then within the prompts, we have what we call the crowd prompts, which is completion, recall, open-ended, and the WH questions that Matt was talking about, and distancing questions. And I think, a lot of that kind of really is part of the tips that Matt was presenting earlier on. So I think, as a parent, what I've done is I would use some of the example prompts that are available within the STEMI website. And then I would start putting little Post-it notes to remind me, page 5, I'm going to be reminded to ask a specific WH question. And I think, as you get a little bit more comfortable with it, you kind of would become, would be able to kind of expand the prompts according to your child's kind of to individualize according to his or her needs. Yeah. And
Needs and
Christine,
interests.
Right,
And then,
yeah.
you do use Matt's tips, and obviously with tiny littles, you start the questioning sort of very simple, and you engage the child with interests and words, and your 1-year-old may not be ready to talk about gravity, but the child would be able to talk about drop. You wouldn't use the word gravity, you'd use the word drop, or ask questions about what they can do, or what they see, or how they feel. So they're adaptive. It's really not prescriptive. You just start talking. You just use words while you talk and read, and then you just get more comfortable doing it, pulling away from necessarily reading from A to B to C to D like we do as adults. You just sort of you pause and just use Matt's tips that he's given us.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to interject, Christine, because I think this feeds into maybe a question we've got coming up from John C. about how prompts fit in with these techniques. And I think it's helpful to think of it like Christine was describing as a interaction that you become more naturalistic with time. It's not a prompt in the sense of, like your ABA style, very behavioral prompt, but it's more kind of an invitation. We use the term prompts because it's helpful to think about your individual child's specific goals and plan the types of questions that you think would address their goals ahead of time. But you also can sort of adapt on the fly if there's something, a page or a topic that's very interesting to them as you read, that can become a great open-ended question.
Mm-hmm.
And John, I would love to hear your feedbacks about how prompts fit into these techniques. Or Matt, I'm sorry.
It's keeping the conversation going. It's keeping the engagement. It's just letting the conversation lead to wherever it's going to go. Because many times, sometimes it leads into something very unexpected. Sometimes it's even a child will start talking about something that's weighing on their mind and not even always clear how you got there. It's just there's so much happening when you're reading with your child or with a child. It's the connection, it's the engagement, it's the and even in COVID-19 with a family member, it's still the closeness and the prompting. It's as you said, the prompting. It takes some practice. It takes a while to get familiar with it, but it's finding the rhythm. And finding the rhythm of talking back and forth. I should add that when you're doing participatory reading and really interactive reading, it becomes a very much a you say something and your student or your child says something and then you say something and they do, and after a while it takes on its own momentum. And then the prompting becomes what you're prompting about instead of the process of just initiating it.
Great. Thank you for that, Matt.
All right, we have a question. Somebody would like to know if you've tried these with live children. I think I
live children.
Have you used these 10 tips with kids live? And then what was the feedback from the kids? I think somebody wants to know how children react to this, because if you're doing this very purposefully, we want to know how the children are going to sort of feed and feedback. And I think you just talked a little bit about that with the back and forth and the conversations unfolding. But if you could talk a little bit more about how you've experienced the children.
That's really a great topic, because at the beginning of the school year, I visit a lot of schools, generally schools for children with learning disabilities or physical disabilities. And at the beginning of the year, parents are just, they don't know what to do. And even right now, I'm doing it virtually with a number of schools and also teachers. And what I've found is that, so generally in that type of environment, it's back to school. It's some sort of either Saturday back to school program or an early evening program. And what happens is the kids and the parents are together, and so I modify the presentation and I do more active reading during it. And oftentimes I will ask a child to come down, whether I'm at the foot of a room or on a small stage, and I will ask a child to come in and participate. So if it's something where it's involving questions and inquiry, then I will line up several kids and ask them to do facial expressions like they're inquiring. And they get into it. And then a lot of kids want to get into it. It becomes, there's a book that I've done this with where a dragon gets a stomach ache. And so there, all of a sudden, you have these kids laying on the floor on their back with their hands on their belly, and they're groaning, and it is so interactive that the parents themselves, and to a lesser extent, teachers. I mean, this is what we do, but for the parents, sometimes they're flabbergasted that their child can get that hooked into a book and into a storyline, even when they don't know the whole story, because it's this demonstration. And it's just opening up the conversation and giving them the chance. And it becomes an activity on itself for them to be the demonstrators. I wonder if anybody else on this panel has had similar experiences like that.
Yeah, I really love the example of the kids rolling on the floor, clutching their stomach. Because I think when we give kids opportunities to distance themselves a little from the text and make personal text self-connections, it can make it so much more playful and fun, and give them an opportunity to be a little bit silly with the story, which really, I think, can open up more conversation about the story and build that language.
I remember reading with my son when he was little, and I used to try to vary voices when I was reading with him. And at one point he said, "Mommy, the voice for that one is all wrong." So that gave me a perfect opportunity to say, well, Ryan, what voice do you think it should have? And then for a while there, we got into that a lot when we were going through books. He would make his own noises. And in some cases, he even said, well, this one doesn't talk, this one rings a bell. And he went to his music stuff and brought that back. So that would be another way to interact with children who may not necessarily be very verbal. You could work in other ways, like, if you find another way to make a sound, if you're trying to sound characters out. That was one thing we used to do.
Something related to that with books where there's counting. If you're working with nonverbal children, something to do is to not ask them, if it's a number series, to not ask them to say the next number or something like that, but just to make a sound or to make some sort of physical movement. And if it's for a child with a significant mobility impairment, not even expect any sound, just some sort of gestural response. And what I've also seen when I've worked with the same children for a whole year is later in the year, they start verbalizing, because sometimes they're holding back for reasons other than they can't produce the sound. So it's always just the engagement. And I love that ringing a bell. That's fabulous.
Yeah, and I think, what you can find like within our storybook reading, storybook conversation series is also, we do have like accompanying like visual cues that you could use with a child. So, if he or she is nonverbal, you could be pointing to, instead of saying sit the cat, you could be pointing to the picture of the cat when you're having that conversations around the storybook.
Or building story boxes. We have some examples of how to do that.
Yep.
Sort of gather some just stuff you have at home.
Right, I have it right here.
Yeah, Fisher Price peoples or stuffed animals or something that go along with the story. And obviously you don't fill the box with 400 things. You pick a few, you start small, you pick sort of the key elements that you're talking about, and you use a story box with them.
Yeah, and Christine, skipping ahead to another question from John C. I kind of thought about the story box and the concept of prompts. He asked, what are some ways that a person can start to use these techniques if they're not familiar or even comfortable with bringing activity into storytelling? And, when I first started teaching, sometimes the pressure of, these 18 little faces looking at me, where do I start? And a prop or a puppet of some sort can really take some of the pressure off a little bit to deliver the perfect interactive dialogic storytelling, and sort of warm the children up too a little bit, that there's an object to focus on. And as you become more familiar with using props, puppets, different objects that are part of the story, you can begin integrating, letting the children handle those on their own to retell parts of the story as well. And I'd be interested to hear Matt and Ching and Christine's thoughts on that too.
I think the most important thing is, before you read the book to your student or your child, know the book. Really know the book. And there's always going to be something in the book that is going to connect to an individual child. It's harder with a whole class, but sometimes when it's a whole class, what I do is I jump over to, instead of it being a one-on-one type of thing, maybe it's the time of year you're learning about the seasons, or maybe it's when you're learning about traveling, and look for that way to connect the book beyond the specific subject to what your community of students is doing or your own student is. And as you do it a few times, you'll always find the way to connect. And that's for me how it always starts. More than anything else, know the book.
Yeah, I do agree. I think, it's not just going into the classroom and pulling something off the shelf, but really knowing the book and going with what the children are all really drawn to. So going with the child's interest. And so it's both, I think, knowing the book as well as knowing the child.
I agree.
And it looks like we have one last question to squeeze in here in the last minute or so from Ed about suggestions for specific texts and a project-based approach that might span several days and keeping in mind various developmental levels. And I know there's probably so many levels to that question, so maybe what's our quick 60-second take?
The 60-second take is the STEMI list of books. Some of those book series, it's all there. I mean, of course, please add to that, but there's so many good books in that collection.
Yeah. And I think building off children's interests, like we've been talking about, knowing that if you choose a book about gardening and perhaps the children become very interested in the concept of seeds or something else, you can follow that then with more texts focused on that.
I think that wraps up our time. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate all of your questions, and you made us sort of talk about what we're excited about. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Matt.